Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Samuel here with Esports, coming at you with another interview. Today we have Benson Lam, and he's the Esports President at TMU, formerly known as Ryerson University, and just so you know, TMU stands for Toronto Metropolitan University. How are you doing, Benson?
Doing well. How about you?
Good, good. So
Mhm.
first things first, not only are you the president of TMU, but you actually were a former pro gamer. Why don't you tell us a bit about that? Tell us about your former organizations, what game you played.
Yeah. So I started my first kind of like adventure into pro play when I was around 13. So I used to go into a lot of like Toronto LANs. So I used to go to like a lot of League of Legends, Hearthstone, that kind of stuff. And then I slowly found a new title that released in like 2015, 2016, Battle Rate. And then it kind of clicked with me as a League of Legends player. It's like a 3v3 arena type game, kind of like a third person, like top down league style game. And then I managed to climb to top 50 in NA. And then I got scouted by G2 Esports. So I played for them professionally for a couple of months. And then because the game kind of died down really fast because the competitive scene wasn't as supported, they transitioned me to their G2 Esports streaming program. So I streamed on Facebook Gaming for close to a year. And then I've just been through multiple gigs. I worked for Team Dignitas as a one point for a writer, and did a lot of work with the other orgs, whether it's hosting tournaments, events, or just being a part of like the whole esports scene in general.
So you've basically done it all.
Yeah.
Um, and when you were with Dignitas as a writer, um, how did point A lead to point B? Like how did you go from pro player with G2 to writer? That's like a big gap. So like fill that gap in for me.
Yeah, I feel like writing, especially when you're talking about esports, it's pretty entry level. I think that because esports writing back then in 2015, 2014 wasn't as developed, they were just looking for people who are really good at the game and could really like vocalize and put down their ideas on paper about like, for example, like gameplay or guides on like champions. So I think they're really looking for like players that could like demonstrate their skill and like tell people about it. So I think that's like the biggest transition there. But nowadays esports writing is so like much more like journalism like. So back then it was a lot easier to get into, but now I think it's a lot more harder to get into.
I see. So
Mm-hmm.
you still do that?
I don't do writing as much. My degree does some writing, like script writing or like event planning, so I do like a little bit time from time.
Right. And what is that degree? So our viewers know.
Yep. I'm in the media production program here at TMU, so it's kind of it's part of the RTA. That's the faculty, so it means radio, television, arts. So it literally handles anything related to media. So, for example, here at TMU, we actually have esports based courses like esports production, where they actually teach you how to run OBS, Streamlabs, how to be a streamer essentially. And it's pretty cool seeing all these esports and video game courses being designed. So, for example, we actually have Unreal Engine courses, and those Unreal Engine courses teach you how to run Unreal Engine, and they actually get you hooked up to internships at Epic Games and even like film studios, for example, since game engines are now being used in film industry. So media production is a whole encapsulation of just the whole media industry in general, and that includes esports and gaming as well.
So, in other words, being a student can be a direct entry path into the esports industry.
Yeah, nowadays like the whole esports and gaming industries just like the sports industry. Like there's so many sectors you get into, and you can really just kind of pinpoint what area and then dive into it. Like for example, there's like the health field in the esports industry is pretty big. Like people are getting like signed doctors to help them with like team practices and everything. So it's just kind of like figuring out what exactly you want to do and try to dive into a specific area of esports, and you'll probably find a space for it.
And in order to get those kind of connections or internships or employment opportunities, is
Mm-hmm.
it just be a good student or is it like do really well in a project? Like, what is it?
Yeah, it's definitely putting yourself out there. I think, especially in university, there's so many opportunities, but some people might be lazy. They might just say, "Oh, this is like a too long of a commitment. I don't want to do this. I'm not sure if my core still can handle it." But as soon as you start kind of adjusting your schedule and really taking those initiatives, you start to go gather those connections and really know what people are looking for when you're looking for like the esports industry. So when people are looking for like, for example, production staff, if you can demonstrate that you did volunteer work for like casting, volunteer work for broadcast, and really show that you really want to be a part of it and you're willing to learn and grow fast, that's what they're mostly interested in. Because esports, if you look in the esports industry now, if you look at a lot of the founders of it, if you ask them if they went to school for esports, they'll probably say no. But nowadays, there's so many paths to get into it. So you really got to demonstrate that you're taking these new advantages that they didn't have before, and really show that you want to learn and grow from the best. You know.
Wow. Yeah, it's like a lot of it may seem like extra, but
Hmm.
it's like it's all part of the equation when, there's so much competition and people are considering you.
Yeah, exactly. It's like probably one of the most competitive industries now, I'd say, because there's so many people wanting to get into it. So
Definitely.
it's kind of a struggle now sometimes. Yeah.
So you mentioned to me privately that you've done some coaching, actually. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so the whole esports industry for me is just like mimicking the whole sports industry. So you have your coaches and everything, and I think because a lot of people they start out young, right? You're seeing a lot more like Valorant pros start out like 15, 16, right? And all these prodigies starting to come in. But a problem with all these players is like when you're 15, 14, you're in like middle school, high school, right? You're not really having any real life issues you need to deal with, right? Like taxes, part-time jobs, you know? So kind of a lot of players kind of need that guiding path to know what exactly they need to do. So back when I was in the high school leagues, when I was in high school, a lot of the teams we were with were kind of just like, oh, we just play video games for tournaments. Hey, we're not going to do this. But I wanted to like really point out like the professionalism that it does carry, and how being professional and being really serious about this can also make pathways in life and make you a better player in general. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people when they want to get into the pro industry, you need someone to help you guide that. You can't just be those kind of players who just grind 24/7 hours. You really need to set yourself apart and really go in the mind of like a pro player, right? So even looking at like sports, you can like mimic like an NBA player and say, hey, this guy's practice time. He does this and that. Here's how he stays like fit and healthy. So you can just like see how that affects your performance, and it usually does like really well.
So when you were doing coaching, was that before or after? It was probably after you spent time as a pro player, right?
Yeah, it was actually during and a little bit after. So a lot of people like looked up to me when because I had like the experience behind me.
Right. So
Mhm.
what games did you coach? And yeah, let's start with that. What games did you coach?
Yeah, I mainly coached CS:GO and also Overwatch back
And that
then.
was with G2.
Yeah, so I wasn't officially signed to G2 for CS:GO or Overwatch. It was just like my side games as well. Because Overwatch I was top 500 for the first like 10 seasons, and CS:GO I was rank A for ESEA as well.
Oh, holy smokes. This is what we call multi-game talented.
Yeah.
Um, so, how would you describe the role of an esports coach? And does it differ from like a regular sports coach?
I would say it's kind of like a mix between like a traditional sports coach and kind of like what's being seen now. Nowadays you're seeing these so many different types of coaches, right? You're seeing like physical health coach, mental health coaches. So I think it's a lot more different now compared to like traditional sports. Sure, there's like the coaches that teach you about gameplay, but there's some specific coaches that teach you about like team play and just kind of like the mental part. So you've actually had like some esports people come in as psychologists and tell us, hey, I'm a coach for your mind instead of your actual play, stuff like that. So I think nowadays it's so varied that there's not really a specific area you can get into, but you just gotta find out which one works for you and then see which works as a team, because each team's different. So saying you're a good coach means that you're a good coach for this and that, but it doesn't mean you're gonna work at every single team. So it's just kind of like a lot of experimentation and seeing kind of what works for each team.
Right. And your
Mm-hmm.
path to being a coach was through a player. So what kind of advice would you give like some guy who just approaches you at a LAN, you don't know much about him, but he asks you about coaching, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, I think being a coach is really difficult. A lot of people think it's just, hey, I'm going to criticize this guy's gameplay. I'm going to criticize this guy's, the way he plays. But it's mainly about just being empathetic, because you're, especially for me, when I was player to coach, right, you actually know how it feels like to be a player. So you actually develop, like, hey, I know how this guy's feeling. I know how it feels to lose a tournament, for example. I know how this guy feels when he's doing bad. So you can really relate to how the player's feeling. And that really drags into, like, the whole, you need to understand where each side is coming from, right? Because some people, when they start off coaching, they're just like, oh, I'm just going to, shit on this guy for being so bad at the game. I'm going to criticize his aim. But at the end of the day, when you look at, like, there's so many metrics you need to look at, and then it's just at the end of the day just more like analytics as well. just seeing like what actually makes these things happen. So coaching is like a whole wide spectrum that you can't really just say, "Hey, I'm a coach." So you just need to like kind of specialize in one area, and it's really just like time consuming because a good coach can be a good coach at this, but he sucks at team play. Like we've had coaches to say, "Hey, I'm good at independent level, but I can't teach like a full team." So that's
I
actually a
see.
common thing now. Yeah.
So, in regards to breaking out into the pro scene as a player, the most surefire way of doing that is just to win. And
Yeah.
you build a reputation doing that. But as a coach, when you approach organizations that like have an opening, what is it that you put on a resume? What is it that makes you look good to these organizations that makes them say, I want to hire this person?
Yeah. It's mainly just experience and just showing that you grinded a long way. Because at the end of the day, if you have like 10 years of experience doing stuff in esports, a lot of people think that's like dedication and grind. But if you have like very few like experience, right? A lot of people are not gonna like look for it. So it's just really like taking as many gigs as possible. It sucks that a lot of stuff in esports isn't paid. So, for example, I did like my early days of writing, early days of like pro play. A lot of them were just volunteer or like no salary at all, right? But the good thing was it buffed up my portfolio, got me connections, got me well known, helped me climb the ladder a lot more. So I think just putting yourself out there and just trying to like show your worth to people, and then eventually those opportunities will start coming in.
It seems to be a common trend among the people I interviewed that they just keep doing it not out of a financial gain, but out of more of a personal necessity, and then the
Hmm.
opportunities start piling on the way, so long as they have
Yeah.
the right mindset, approach, and just a little bit of luck.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, how far in are you at TMU?
Yep, I'm approaching my final year, so this year will be my final year at TMU, but hopefully it's going to be really big. We have
So,
our own facility coming on campus, and the whole esports growth and the whole collegiate space is like really developing here.
fourth year undergraduate.
Yep.
I see, I see. And when you say the whole space is developed, does that mean like you have your own like esports room and stuff like that, or
Yeah, here at TMU, we're actually developing our own Red Bull gaming lab, so it's
holy
going to be a whole
smokes?
like kind of like a mini facility for us to use and play out of. And you're starting to see this a lot more in like Canadian schools, but we're still super behind compared to the U.S. I'd say we're 3 to 5 years behind some of the U.S. schools.
And what kind of lead does the U.S. schools have that Canada doesn't?
I mean, the first thing is just varsity support. So in the U.S., a lot of esports, the states, right, they declared esports as a varsity sport, so they get the same treatment as like varsity football, baseball, whatever. So they actually get like scholarships, funding. They can actually hire staff for esports. And here in Canada, especially in Ontario where we're at, it's not even considered varsity or like an actual. It's just considered a recreational sport. So we don't get like dedicated funding as much. We can't pay salaries. We're just kind of volunteer based, and that makes it so a lot of people aren't really dedicated to like the whole collegiate space here. But as soon as we start offering these kind of benefits, that's when people are going to start developing even more into us. But the good thing is there's a lot of schools and companies pushing for that here. So, for example, like Memory Express, MSI, they're kind of driving the Canadian collegiate space. And you see schools like St. Clair, for example, they have their own $16 million facility being built with scholarships and full staff support. But universities have a lot more money, but they're not dedicating that amount of funds, right? So it's kind of crazy to see how the universities are so behind on that just because they don't see the value in esports. But as schools like TMU and St. Clair start to build up these facilities and show the value, I think that's when we'll start seeing a lot more development. But still, we're compared to the US, we're so slow on it.
I see. So, how on earth did you guys get Red Bull as a sponsor for your guys' esports room?
Yeah, I mean, Red Bull has been one of the early founders of esports. They've been sponsoring tournaments since the 1990s, right? So it's kind of, and they're really homegrown to Toronto as well. So Toronto hosts a lot of esports events, and a lot of them are backed by Red Bull. So to kind of developing that relationship over time, whether it's like the past presidents, for example, we've kind of developed that relationships where they want to invest into these kind of campus spaces.
I see. And it sounds like they're a title sponsor for.
Yep,
I
definitely.
see. And you mentioned a $16 million facility from St. Clair Esports. Like,
Hmm.
what are they building with that kind of money, and how did they get that kind of money?
I mean, it's just all funding, because the issue is Canada, we barely have anything like that. So when you do pitch it to investors, you can say, hey, we're going to be the first in Canada, right?
Right.
So that's really attractive, but a lot of schools aren't really willing to take that risk, but St. Clair was. So just developing those funds. And 16 million is very small compared to the US, right? For example, Maryville University is one of like the top ones, like same with UC Irvine as well. They have like full on facilities. Like how like football is viewed in the, American
Yeah, yeah,
sports,
oh
right? Like
yeah.
college football. They have like the same level of like rooms and practice areas and stages for the esports players, right? And that would be a dream for us to have, but for them, that's like normal day to day basis, right?
Well,
But
I'm
here,
glad.
there's nothing.
I'm
Yeah.
glad all of that American tuition money is going somewhere good.
Yeah,
uh,
but I mean the crazy thing, all their players are getting full ride scholarships, so it's just like, well, we can't offer that here, so they're getting paid like they don't even have to pay tuition, they just have to pay for housing.
oh my
Sometimes
gosh.
that's provided. Yeah.
If only I was born like 5 years later. So I
Yeah.
was joking. So in regards to TMU, it's one university among many in the Toronto area. So do you
Mhm.
guys like collaborate between other universities? Is it like do do the sum of the parts? What can you guys do together?
Yeah, we always try to collaborate in the whole like Ontario scene. So we try to host in-person events, whether it's inviting like watch parties in like downtown, and campuses are pretty like close apart, but not too like far. Where it's like a good like hour commute between most like other universities like York or some other U of T campuses, right? So we try to involve all the whole Toronto scene because at the end of the day, we want to all develop and grow, right? So it's not just like, hey, we want to be the first one to do this. We want to grow the whole esports scene here. Because at the end of the day, if it's just us growing, we're kind of not really building up the scene, right? We're being selfish ourselves. So we really want every other club to grow. And when we do all grow together, that's when we can approach the OUA and say, hey, look at all these schools with their esports programs. Make us varsity. Make us get scholarships. Make us get a salary. So it's just not about like focusing on ourselves. It's focusing about the whole community as a whole.
Right. I think esports is getting a lot more, rapidly getting a lot more exposure. I completely
Mm-hmm.
agree that we're far behind the States. When I was speaking with Simon Fraser University, they were mentioning getting into the eyes of faculty.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you guys have you guys had that sort of experience yet, that run-in with faculty at TMU?
For sure. I mean, ever since our club's history, we've always had issues with faculty not understanding.
Issues.
And
Okay.
yeah, so one of our two, we have really a lot of faculty that supports us now because two faculty members joined us a few years ago, Dr. Christopher Alexander and Jeffrey LaChapelle. And Dr. Chris Alexander, I think, is like one of the only doctors with a PhD in video games.
I
So he
didn't even know
actually has
that
a
existed.
PhD. Yeah, but he's like a crazy research guy, and he's kind of been the driving force into video game programming into our school. And because of that, now they're the most popular courses. So, for example, his video game design course, his intro to video game design, has a full cap of like 600 plus slots. And compared to last year there's only 140 students that apply to that course. This year there's 600. So now he's really driving faculty support, and a lot of people are now getting more on board onto that. Because I think Jeffrey LaChapelle mentioned this to me before when explaining to how faculty works, is that a lot of the faculty on the high end level where they actually approve funding, right? They get the funding, they approve all of it. A lot of them are like 56 years old, right?
Right.
And they're born in the era where video games wasn't known to them. They probably didn't even play video games back then when they were a kid, or didn't even have video games growing up, right? And their perception of video games is still that it causes violence. It's
Yeah,
still a
yeah.
hobby, right? So we kind of need to break that mindset, and once we break that down, that's when we can start getting more faculty support and more like understanding between different areas, right? And kind of showing that in an educational aspect as well, whether it's like developing these video game courses, Unreal Engine, showing there's a career in esports and gaming. Once you show that value, that's when they start supporting definitely.
I see. And
Mm-hmm.
and just in my personal experiences, it's not just showing that there are careers in the industry, but also that the career has like this sort of um, I'll say there's like sort of a stigma against it right now, where
Yeah.
it's like even if you have a career in it, regardless of the pay, it's like just sort of frowned upon because it's like, whether it's a waste of time or you're enabling or encouraging others to waste their time.
Mhm.
What do you you know it's great that there's so much progression being happened, but in the now, for the people who need the support now, from whether it's their social circle, their families, or yeah, professors, what would you say to those people to help get that kind of support to sort of fight the stigma?
Yeah, I mean it's pretty. There's no like clear answer. I think it's still like being thought out, and I mean it's justified that people are concerned about the whole career in esports and gaming because I think the number one issue right now is just job security, right? You're
Right.
seeing a lot of these tier one orgs like 100 Thieves recently just laid off like I don't know like at least 50 to 80 like different workers in their social marketing teams, and you see it's a common trend. Like TSM laid off a bunch of people recently, a bunch of orgs did as well, and you're thinking these are the tier one orgs that have $200 million in funding, right? Why are they letting go of some of these like senior like people? So I think it's a really tough answer to give, but providing value is just like the biggest thing. Like especially if you're doing it from like a startup angle, just like showing that the career has like a pathway, whether it's not just esports but just business as well, right? And showing there's multiple avenues to approach it from is definitely the best way. So for example, if you're like trying to just work for a streaming company, right? You like just streamers, right? Well, you kind of need to expand on that, right? You need to do like, hey, we can do broadcasts, we can do events, we can do virtual events as well, in person, and kind of develop that different areas. So if something does go wrong, you have a backup for it. So I think that's what a lot of people try to mess up on a lot. They're like, hey, we're gonna make this esports org. We only have one team that's really good, right? Well, we need to have backup. If that team fails or they get bought up by another team, you're gonna have nothing, right?
Right.
So just having those like backups and really expanding upon different avenues is like the biggest thing you can do to support in case of like any issues up here.
Right. So in other words, just a business model that is sort of like multi-purpose, like a Swiss Army knife that can sort of just do lots of things.
Yeah, exactly. Because at the end of the day, it's just like this industry is so fast paced, so people are bound to get lost, you know.
Absolutely.
Hmm. Yeah.
So when you mentioned, with the layoffs and everything, it just sort of reminded me that, regardless of esports growing at such an exponential rate, one thing that it is still lacking and, makes it seem almost primitive in comparison to some other industries, that we don't have a union. There's no sort
Yeah.
of esports union.
Yeah. I mean, this might just be a hot take, but I think it's a pretty like common take nowadays is that the issue with esports is that it's all funded based off of investor money, right? So if your investors don't like what you're doing, you're going to get fired and laid off, right? A
Right.
lot of this has happened before. Like a lot of teams had to drop their teams because their teams weren't performing well, or like investors are backing out. You see a lot in like the Overwatch League, for example, how shrunk it's been ever since the Activision Blizzard issues. And you see this now with like a lot of controversial companies buying into esports, and teams have to say yes because now they're bought out by that company. For example, like Saudi Arabia is getting into esports. They have horrible human rights issues, but teams are still forced to go because hey, we need the money, right?
Right.
So I think in order for like the whole ecosphere to be better, right, we need to find a way to generate our own income and revenue without all these like investor money and trying to like get sponsors, right? Like trying to make a self-sustaining way so like we don't have so companies and teams, especially startup teams, don't have to rely on these like investors, like especially when they're really sketchy, right?
Right.
Like I
Oh
don't want to say
yeah.
like, yeah, like it's an issue when you start seeing like gambling and like, NFT like crypto stuff, for example, when it's like really sketchy, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of people just really need to do research nowadays because some teams are really taking like the bag instead of thinking about like the whole long-term effects of it.
So, what sort of I don't know if you've thought about it. What sort of ideas would you have to sort of get this stream of money that doesn't come from investors to, sort of keep people going without the absolute, survival depending on sponsors.
Yeah, I think it just needs it's definitely hard. I mean, there's no like there
Clear,
has to be
easy
a
answer.
multi-step.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I'm just thinking that is probably the most organic way is just going back to grassroots, right? Going to where the esports industry started, where everyone who was interested got in, pooled together, and made something happen, right? So you really gotta go back to like the connections and see what is actually directly connected to esports, whether it's like technology companies, streaming companies, broadcast companies, and not look at like random just companies that just have $2 billion and just take that, you know. So just really going back to those grassroots and seeing what made esports, and seeing who really wants to actually see the scene grow rather than just make some money off of it, right? So I mean, you see that with like a lot of the franchise teams, right? Like the NALCS, Overwatch League. A lot of these teams are just backed by, MLB teams, NBA teams. They're just trying to make more money off their brand, right? But
Right.
you really need to see that more like home pitched teams, you know. Like I think one of my favorite ones is like Moist Esports, for example. Moist Critical founded the team, and he's just like a content creator who just made his own team because he wanted to, and they're all just funded by him, right? And now they're winning like the Rocket League championship and becoming a really big org, and there's all grassroots, right? Not just from like investors and all these like sponsors and everything. So just going back to what made esports.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, it's still sort of investor money, but when you break it down that way, it's like sort of easy to say that about any occupation.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's just like if the sponsor is like directly tied to esports, that's perfectly fine. But nowadays you're seeing sponsors come in from like, hey, we're like a housing company,
right.
like out of like some random country. Hey, we have $400 million. You guys will take it, right? And obviously most orders will say yes, right? So
Right. So in regards to the instability of that sort of like sketchy side, what sort of advice would you have for you know, entry esports people who might not understand or be able to see these red flags? Like, what sort of tips would you give these people?
I mean, it's always just seeing like the company and kind of like what their goals are. So if you see a company and their goals are obviously to like be a championship team, and you really want to see like the initiatives that they're providing, right? Is this team just only here for the money? Like, what do these guys compete in, or like what like company does this thing do? Like, what services do they provide? You really gotta look at the whole scope and see, hey, what is going to happen long term? Because right now a lot of people are going into short term things, and they always don't last long. Like in the whole esports thing, I think most people want to work long term, right? Like more than a couple of years. But nowadays it's so common just to be short term, right? Like pro players being traded, coaching staff, people being laid off from marketing, and moving between different orgs. So I think just trying to find what you excel at and see that position you're at, and then try to stay in that as well.
Right. So I think part of the reason why there's so much short-term things going on is that just unfortunately because the industry is such a feeding frenzy in
Mm-hmm.
regards to the competition, people are quick to grab onto opportunities that pass by them, regardless of, basically almost any opportunity is a good opportunity. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in the case of the answer you just gave, how do you know when to, for lack of a better term, know when to value yourself and hold out for something better, or to take what you have that's coming up?
Yeah, I think it's just like reviewing what your strengths are and what different things you provide to your role. So, for example, I think one of the biggest examples is just like broadcast, for example, right? That's like always a need because every single game needs a broadcast team, production team, and there's so much competition. You see these internships and everything, but when you really go down to the interview for it, right? What sets you apart, and how can you like display that? So, for example, if you look at like League of Legends broadcasting, you're like, hey, um, I can like move the camera really well. I can like know hotkeys, right? But when you surely have that initiative and that key distinctive touch that you really trying something new, and you can display that, right? It's gonna change like the whole like perspective, right? So one of the people I worked with, he's like, "Hey, I do a broadcast," and I'm like, "Okay, sure, like that's pretty cool. Here's your portfolio." I'm like, "Oh wait, he does this like whole different replay thing. How does he do that?" And I'm like, "Oh, he has like a whole separate keyboard that he built and programmed himself that has all these hotkeys about everything. He has a second monitor that he specifically designed. He made his own program to handle replay systems in the game. He coded that himself." And when I saw that, I'm like, damn, this guy actually knows what he's doing. And that's what sets him apart so well compared to other candidates. So immediately I was like, yes, 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 yes. So when you actually show you have this dedication and this distinct feature about you that sets yourself a really far apart, then go for it. Whether it's like a prototype, for example, as long as you're showing that dedication and showing that you really want to excel and make something new in the scene. Because at the end of the day, esports is always growing. So when you want to show that you're growing too, then that's like super attractive for long term positions.
All right, Benson, we got to get wrapping up here. Thank you
Yep.
so much for the interview. What sort of, advice would you have just generally for people getting into esports? I always ask this at the end of every interview.
Yeah.
And, as I would say consummate professional that you are, what sort of, tips would you have for people coming in?
I mean, just try everything. I mean, for me, I was like always doing, ever since I was like 14, I always tried everything, whether it's like broadcasting, streaming, pro play, coaching, and just doing everything in your power to just develop and grow. It doesn't have to be directly into esports. A lot of people never really studied for esports, but they got into it because of just like how different areas relate, like business, marketing. As long as you can find value in what you do and show that you want to really work in the industry, you can make it anywhere. So I mean, always play games, always try to like be a part of the scene. Networking is the biggest thing, especially on like social media and just like in games, discords, for example. And just always try to be engaging and really show that you want to be in the scene. Because at the end of the day, all the top people are just grinding their hearts out right now. So if you aren't grinding too, then you're just gonna fall behind really fast. Because everyone else is trying to get esports positions. So once you really dedicate and show that you're willing to, be in it for a long run, then that's what will get you into it here.
I'll just add a bit to the end of that. In regards to reaching out and making connections, a lot of high-end people, though they may be busy, some of them are easily accessible on social media. If you think you've got something special, it never hurts to try, as long as you're not a total weirdo, never hurts
Yeah.
to try out and just reach out to these people and see if they'll help you, in small ways. Obviously, don't ask them for big things, but
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
All right. Thanks so much again for the interview, Benson. It was nice meeting you.
Yep, thank you.